This video is going to talk about how you can engage your audience, and an engaging speech is an effective speech, so it's really important to understand how to do it. In order to engage your audience, there's two different techniques that you can utilize. The first is using non-factual sources. I briefly mentioned that in the last video. I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about it today. And the second one is making your audience active. So let's first start talking about non-factual sources. When we talk about supporting material, it breaks down into two things. Factual, which are your facts and statistics, obviously, and your non-factual. Now, keep in mind, I'm not deeming them non-factual because they're not true. It's because they work in conjunction with factual material. So factual material is typically more dense, usually less interesting. Non-factual is lighter and more lively and also helps to illustrate what a factual source is saying. So it breaks down into four things. We have narratives, which are stories, visuals, testimony, which are quotes, and examples. Let's start talking about narratives and examples first. So when we look at examples, these are basically concrete things that you can point to illustrate what you're talking about. So for instance, let's say you bring up common currency. Your audience might not fully understand what this actually is until you give them an example of euro. Oh, okay, the euro, right? Most of the countries in the European Union have agreed to utilize this as one form of money. Or let's say you're talking about something like catfishing, right? They may understand it, but they won't be able to fully grasp the concept until maybe you use the example of Manti Te'o. For those who don't remember, this is the Notre Dame football player who had his girlfriend. She died of leukemia, and then it turned out she didn't exist. It was this person online who was pretending to be a girl, and he had never met her, and it became this whole scandal. So these are two things that you could point to, again, to really help make sure your audience fully understands what you're talking about. Now, if we look at narratives, these are more extended versions of examples, and they're particularly important in demonstrating what you're trying to talk about and also to add an emotional connection for the audience. So let's say I was doing a speech on bullying. I might want to do a story that truly shows the impact of bullying, so I could talk about Tyler Clemente. Now, for those who don't remember, this was the Rutgers student who he was gay and he hadn't yet come out, and his roommate and roommate's girlfriend taped Tyler having sex and broadcast this, and Tyler found out about it. He jumped off the bridge and committed suicide. And this story is extremely sad, but I think it's an effective one at demonstrating the fatal consequences of bullying, right? That it's not just making fun of someone or humiliating someone, but in fact that these do have very grave consequences. Another example is genetic markers. Now, this could be a topic that maybe a lot of people in the audience feel they don't relate to, they can't connect to. But if you use a narrative of something that we're all familiar with, you might be able to. So I could bring up Angelina Jolie. For those of you who aren't that familiar with this situation, Angelina Jolie watched her mother battle breast cancer for years and then unfortunately succumbed to that battle and she died. Angelina Jolie later tested herself for the BRCA1 gene and found that she was in fact positive for it. And this gene means that you have a very, very high likelihood of getting breast cancer or ovarian cancer. So she made the decision to have a double mastectomy before even getting diagnosed with breast cancer. And a lot of people are really shocked by this. But again, both of these stories really help humanize topics that maybe the audience doesn't connect to or just doesn't see as something that they would want to listen to. Another thing to keep in mind when using narratives is not only are they something that really do help add an emotional tone, but they help people remember the information. In this book, these two professors who are actually brothers did a study and they looked at students who were listening to speeches. The students had to actually listen to 10 one-minute speeches, and each speech that they listened to had about 2 to 3 statistics on average. Of the 10 speeches, only one of the speeches contained a narrative. Now, once the students were asked what they remembered, 63% remembered the story, where only 5% remembered the actual statistic itself. So again, if you connect your factual and non-factual, you can really help to not only explain information, but get your audience to remember it, which is ultimately the most important thing when trying to educate audience members. Now, testimony and visuals. Let's start with testimony. Remember, testimony is just another word for quotes. And when we're talking about quotes, they break into two different things. We have expert testimony and lay testimony. Expert testimony is basically what it sounds. It's someone who studies whatever the topic is, right? If we're talking about maybe the weather, it's a meteorologist, or something scientific, it's a researcher or a professor. When you utilize expert testimony, you want to make sure that you cite the individual and how they're credible. Again, just kind of like what you do for your factual sources in the speech. So here's an example. According to Dr. Smith, a researcher from the Cato Institute. So let's say you're doing a speech on aviation. Your expert testimony might be a pilot. Now, as opposed to expert testimony, you could use lay testimony. Lay testimony is someone who's not an expert. They're the opposite. Instead of studying it and having this very objective perspective on it, they're someone who is personally attached to the topic. We typically use this to get kind of a pulse on a group to understand what's going on, how they feel, or what their reactions are to something. And when you cite this, you do want to make sure you name the person you're quoting and how they connect. So for instance, you could have Sarah Johnson, a current Palm Beach State student. So let's say you're doing a speech on student loan debt, right? If it was expert testimony, you might actually use an economist. They might be really good to give you kind of a bigger picture of how this is affecting the economy. But if we're doing lay testimony, you would talk to a student, right? To get the perspective of how on a day-to-day basis it might be difficult for them to pay their bills because they have these huge payments, or, they want to make a career change, but now they can't because they're saddled with $100,000 worth of debt. Testimony can be really, really good in getting these two different perspectives. The other thing to keep in mind with testimony is you can also use impactful quotes. So here's one that I really love from Mark Twain. It usually takes me more than 3 weeks to prepare a good impromptu speech. So quotes that have humor or quotes that are really dramatic, those can also add interest to your speech as well. The next thing to look at is visuals. Now, visuals can be anything from an object, a prop, a video, really anything that your audience can actually see. And visuals can be particularly important to use when words fail you. And I think we can look to many examples of how visuals can be powerful. But one really recent example was a picture that was viral on social media. And this was a photo of a Syrian toddler who, with his family, had tried to get to Europe and ultimately passed away. And this is a photo of someone actually carrying his body. And people reacted to this image, calling for European countries to let these Syrian immigrants in and donate money and aid. And it was a very powerful image. So when you utilize pictures, they can be very effective. However, you want to keep in mind that it's not a distraction. So a lot of the times I'll have students who will just kind of put pictures on PowerPoints or on Prezis that they think are cool or interesting, but they're not really something that helps. So remember, does this aid my presentation? If the answer is yes, you can utilize it. Also kind of think, does this pass the CRAP test, right? So particularly here you'd want to think of relevancy. Is this really connected directly to what I'm saying? Is this connected to the situation, right? Is it appropriate for the class? So I, love my grumpy cat memes, but no, this particular one would not connect. So you would want to leave that out. Another question I typically get is, can I use PowerPoint? So yes, you can, but a lot of times people will read word for word off the PowerPoint. Please do not do that. In class, we will be talking about the best way to utilize PowerPoint, but you can use it. So, an effective speech, like for instance, Amy Cuddy's TED Talk, will utilize all of these things. So think about it. She had a chart as a visual. She also had pictures as visuals. In addition, she actually used her own personal story. So she used a narrative. She also quoted researchers, and she gave examples that we could all relate to of famous people. So really effective speeches are going to use all of these non-factuals. Now that we've talked about non-factuals, let's move on to talk about engaging the audience through making them active. So keep in mind, passive audience members, audiences that aren't doing anything, are bored audiences. You want to go back to the rhetorical triangle and think about you as a speaker. You want to be engaging, so you have to consider your purpose, right, which is to educate, and how do you really do that in a way that's effective for the audience. So when you think of a speech, think of it as a dialogue, right, a back and forth, a conversation. It shouldn't just be you talking the entire time straight to your audience. What you want to do when you're trying to make an effective informative speech is consider learning styles, because essentially you're becoming an educator in this speech. So you have auditory, which obviously hearing your voice will function for that. Visual, I just talked about non-factuals, but the last one is particularly important, tactile or kinesthetic, getting your audience to do something. So how do you incorporate that into your speech? There's a couple of different techniques. One, and this is an easy one, ask a question, right? When you do it, you want to be specific and be committed. I'll talk about that in a second. And you could also poll your audience. So, with asking a question, be specific. The reason I'm saying this is because sometimes people will be like, well, how are you all doing? Or, well, what do you guys think about this? Something that's very vague, very open. When you do that, you're going to get this reaction, right? I have no idea what they're talking about or what they want me to say. You don't want to do that. Ask something very specific. Do you like this? Yes or no, right? Typically, when it's a close-ended question, meaning there's only really one or two responses that they can say, that's the best one. So keep it very specific. Don't make it a broad, unclear question. And you have to be committed. A lot of times I'll have students who'll ask a question. They'll be like, okay, how do you feel? And then they'll just keep talking and da-da-da-da-da-da. They don't even give the audience a chance to actually answer the question. So you really do have to be committed. There might be a time at which you ask a question and everyone is silent and you hear crickets, right? So what you want to do if you do end up in that situation is wait a second. I know it might be painful, but someone might answer. It just might take them a second. Or you can re-ask the question and see if you could get an answer that way. I can tell you there's been many times where I've stood in front of a classroom, asked a question, and no one has said anything. Just ask it again. Maybe say your answer. Well, what I feel is da-da-da-da-da. So how do you guys, what do you think? Something to just kind of get them out of their shells. The other thing you can also do is encourage interaction. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. One is just get your audience to do something physical. I had a student who did a speech on CrossFit, and he got his audience up and they did some CrossFit moves. Nothing this complicated, of course. You could also call out specific listeners. Like I was talking to Anna the other day about CrossFit, and she said she just started it and she really loves it. So calling people out can also be effective. Another thing is you can ask for a volunteer, so maybe pull someone up and get them to talk about their experience with CrossFit. Now, one thing I might recommend is, especially for this class specifically, ask someone ahead of time if you're going to ask them to volunteer, because everyone's really nervous on speech day and some people might not want to go up, so you don't want to point someone out and then they say they not want to come up and it gets awkward. So essentially when you're asking for a volunteer, you're really kind of voluntelling them, so just give them a heads up. That's always effective. So, how do you incorporate all this stuff into your speech? Well, let me give you an example. Let's say you're doing a speech on tattoos and you have this statistic, right? In the U.S., more women than men are tattooed, which I found really interesting. I was surprised by this statistic. But you could just offer this statistic and move on. But in fact, that would be really boring. What you want to start thinking about when thinking of how to engage your audience is change your information into an opportunity to engage your audience. So we can take this statistic and turn it into a question, right? Who do you think has more tattoos, men or women? Get the audience to guess, and then once they give you an answer, tell them the statistic. You could turn it into an activity, right? Ask someone to show you their tattoo. Maybe you can call them up and have them show it to you. And then, depending on whether it's a man or woman, connect it, right? If it's a man, you could say, well, he has a tattoo, but in fact, it's really that women have more tattoos. or call out a listener, right? I know Sarah has a pretty tattoo, and that isn't unusual since more women than men have tattoos. In fact, and then that'll just lead you right into the statistic. So keep in mind, you want to utilize both the non-factuals and the engagement as a way to really turn in the information that you have into something that's interesting, something that they'll understand, and something that they'll remember. And that's what these techniques really do very effectively. Okay, so that is it. Homework. What is the difference between expert and lay testimony? Are non-factual sources untrue? And explain why. Name 2 techniques for engaging your audience. And since I made the video a bit shorter this time, create the introduction and the first 2 points of your speech. Now, the introduction you started already in class, so that shouldn't be too much. And the first 2 points you started in the speech framer. So again, this isn't too much to ask for. But what it does need to be is typed, so you can bring it in digitally on your laptop, or you can just print it and give it to me. You also have to have sources within it. So I want the things that I talked about in the last video as far as having source material, additional material, the factual material, any of those things. And your introduction must be completely done. All the steps should be there. And then starting your first 2 points, you need to have information sources and it needs to be typed. And that is it.